Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Wednesday, September 4, 2024. A deadly shooting at a high school in Winder, Georgia. 4 people killed, 9 others sent to the hospital. Authorities say the suspect is 14 years old. In presidential politics, Democratic nominee Kamala Harris is in New Hampshire talking about her tax plan to help startup businesses. Republican nominee Donald Trump is interviewed today on a New Hampshire radio station. Justice Department seizes internet domains and charges 2 Russian citizens employed by RT in a $10 million campaign to influence the 2024 U.S. election through disinformation published online. House Speaker Mike Johnson plans to attach a bill requiring proof of U.S. citizenship to vote to a bill to extend federal government funding to prevent a shutdown. We'll talk about the strategy with Mychael Schnell, congressional reporter for The Hill. New York Governor Kathy Hochul calls it absolutely shocking one of her former aides has been charged with working for the Chinese government in exchange for millions of dollars. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at a news conference in Jerusalem asked about his reluctance to give up control of the strip of land between Gaza and Egypt as part of a ceasefire deal, even after the recent murder of 6 hostages by Hamas. And the UN Security Council meets on the war in Gaza and the more than 100 hostages still held there. From ABC News, 2 students and 2 teachers were killed in a shooting at Appalachia High School in Winder, Georgia on Wednesday morning, according to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. Another 9 victims were taken to hospitals with injuries, the GBI said. The suspect, 14-year-old Colt Gray, a student at Appalachia High School, was encountered by officers within minutes, and he immediately surrendered and was taken into custody. He will be charged with murder and will be tried as an adult, the GBI said. It's not clear if any of the victims were targeted, authorities said. That was from ABC News. Governor Brian Kemp, Republican of Georgia, posting on X, "I have directed all available state resources to respond to the incident at Appalachia High School and urge all Georgians to join my family in praying for the safety of those in our classrooms, both in Barrow County and across the state. We will continue to work with local, state, and federal partners as we gather information and further respond to this situation." That was the post from Governor Brian Kemp. At a news conference outside the school, here's the county sheriff, Judge Smith.
I never imagined that I would be speaking to the media in my career over something that happened today, the pure evil that happened today. I cannot thank the people behind me for the support they give me today, to give this office and give this staff. This hits home for me. I was born and raised here. I went to school in this school system. My kids go to this school system. I'm proud of this school system. My heart hurts for these kids. My heart hurts for our community. But I want to make it very clear that hate will not prevail in this county. I want that to be very clear and known. Love will prevail over what happened today. I assure you of that. It is very early as to what happened. Governor Kemp reached out to me and has provided me every single resource that he has to make sure justice prevails. I don't know why it happened. I may not ever know. We may not ever know. But I ask that you and our community lift up our schools, lift up our public safety, and that, again, we do not let this hateful event prevail as to what happened today.
Barrow County Sheriff Judge Smith holding a news conference outside the school in Winder, Georgia, Appalachia High School after the shooting. Vice President Kamala Harris, the Democratic presidential nominee, spoke about the shooting at the start of her campaign stop today in New Hampshire.
So before I begin, I do want to say a few words about this tragic shooting that took place this morning in Winder, Georgia. We're still gathering information about what happened, but we know that there were multiple fatalities and injuries. And, you know, our hearts are with all the students, the teachers, and their families, of course. And we are grateful to the first responders and the law enforcement that were on the scene. But this is just a senseless tragedy on top of so many senseless tragedies. And it's just outrageous that every day in our country, in the United States of America, that parents have to send their children to school worried about whether or not their child will come home alive. It's senseless. It is, we've got to stop it. And we have to end this epidemic of gun violence in our country once and for all. You know, it doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be this way. So we will continue, of course, to send our prayers and our thoughts to the families and all those who were affected, including, you know, I'm going off script right now, but listen, I mean, you know, at the last year, I started a college tour. And I traveled our country meeting with our young leaders, right? And so it was college-age young leaders. So I did trade schools, colleges, universities, community colleges. By the way, I love Gen Z. I just love Gen Z, right? But I'll tell you, one of the things that I asked every time I went to the auditorium, and it would be filled with these young leaders, students, and I'd ask them, raise your hand if at any point between kindergarten and 12th grade you had to endure an active shooter drill. And for the young leaders who are here who are raising their hand, I'm telling you, every time the auditorium was packed and almost every hand went up. You know, a lot of us, I'll speak about myself, you know, we had, well, I grew up in California, earthquake drills, we had fire drills, but our kids are sitting in a classroom where they should be fulfilling their God-given potential, and some part of their big, beautiful brain is concerned about a shooter busting through the door of the classroom. It does not have to be this way. It does not have to be this way. And, you know, this is one of the many issues that's at stake in this election.
Vice President Kamala Harris, Democratic presidential nominee, today in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The Republican presidential nominee, former President Donald Trump, posting on his Truth Social platform, "Our hearts are with the victims and loved ones of those affected by the tragic event in Winder, Georgia. These cherished children were taken from us far too soon by a sick and deranged monster." And Congressman Mike Collins, Republican of Georgia, whose district includes Appalachian High School, posting, "Leanne and I are praying for the victims, their families, and all students at Appalachian High School in Barrow County. We extend our gratitude to law enforcement for their swift action to secure the school and get the shooter in custody. I have spoken with Sheriff Smith and told him my team and I are available to assist in any way necessary. We will continue to monitor and provide updates as prudent." The White House said as this was unfolding, President Biden has been briefed by his Homeland Security Advisor Liz Sherwood-Randall on the tragic shooting at Appalachian High School in Winder, Georgia, and his administration will continue coordinating with federal, state, and local officials as we receive more information. And then later in the afternoon, the White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre held a news conference.
This week, kids across the country are heading back to school for the new school year. Today is supposed to be an exciting day for students and parents, but instead, we're seeing yet another horrific shooting. Now, as a parent myself, I know the anxiety that comes with sending your kid out into the world every day, living with the real fear of the worst can happen. So please know that our hearts are with those families in Winder, Georgia, who are forced to face this act of senseless violence. I want to let you know that the President and the Vice President have both been briefed, and his administration will continue coordinating with federal, state, and local officials as we receive more information. We're grateful for the brave first responders who are on the scene, and we stand by, we stand ready to provide support as needed. As the President has said time and time again, this is not normal. This is not normal. Students and teachers deserve to know that their schools are safe. They should focus on learning, not lockdowns. While the President and Vice President have taken historic action to reduce gun violence, more must be done to keep our schools and communities safe. We continue to call on Congress to do something, We need universal background checks. We need to ban assault weapons and high-capacity magazines, require safe storage of firearms, invest in violence prevention programs, and pass a national red flag law. Enough is enough, and I cannot say this enough, which is enough is enough. We cannot allow this to happen in our communities. We cannot allow this to happen in our schools. So we have to do everything that we can to keep our children safe, to keep the people who are supposed to protect our children, who are they supposed to learn from, safe. And enough is enough. Congress needs to act.
White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre at her news conference today. House Speaker Mike Johnson, Republican from Louisiana, posting on X, "Our prayers go out today for the Appalachia high school community, and especially the victims and their families who have endured this terrible tragedy. The officers of the Winder Police Department are commended for their quick action in apprehending the suspect. May justice here be swift." That was the post from Speaker Mike Johnson. This is Washington Today. From Reuters, Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris heads to New Hampshire on Wednesday to unveil a $50,000 tax deduction for new small businesses as she works to win over independent voters and Republicans skeptical of former President Donald Trump. The vice president will announce the plan in Northampton, New Hampshire, as a measure to stimulate economic growth, the campaign officials said. Small businesses are major employers and have created 70% of net new U.S. jobs since 2019, according to government data. Harris will appear at a brewery, joined by elected officials and a leader of a Republicans for Harris group in New Hampshire. That was from Reuters. Here's part of the vice president's speech.
I want to see 25 million new small business applications by the end of my first term. And to help achieve this, we will lower the cost of starting a new business. So here's the thing. On average, it costs about $40,000 to start a new business in America. That is a great financial barrier for a lot of folks, and it can hold entrepreneurs back. And the current tax deduction for a startup is just $5,000, okay? So then you got to make up the delta there. Got to figure out how you're going to do that. Not everyone has access to that kind of wealth and capital. So part of my plan is we will expand the tax deduction for startups to $50,000. It's essentially a tax cut for starting a small business. Second, my plan will help existing small businesses grow. We will provide low and no interest loans to small businesses that want to expand, and we will, and this is very important, cut the red tape that can make starting and growing a small business more difficult than it needs to be. More difficult than it needs to be. For example, we will make it cheaper and easier for small businesses to file their taxes. Similar to how individuals can take a standard deduction. You know, I said to my team, kind of like, now I'm going to date myself again because they no longer do it, but kind of like, you remember the 1040 EZ? Like that kind of idea, right? Like, let's just take away some of the bureaucracy in the process to make it easier for people to actually do something that's going to benefit our entire economy.
Vice President Kamala Harris, Democratic presidential nominee in Portsmouth, New Hampshire today. Again, from the Reuters article on her campaign visit, the vice president has her eyes on independent voters in the state, where 330,000 registered independents outnumber Democrats and Republicans. The state has supported a Democratic candidate in every presidential election since 1992, except for former President George W. Bush's 2000 win. U.S. President Joe Biden beat Donald Trump in the state by 7 percentage points in 2020. That was from Reuters. Former President Donald Trump, the Republican presidential nominee, this morning was interviewed on the Good Morning New Hampshire radio show by host Jack Heath. It airs on Pulse of New Hampshire news talk radio stations.
Biden and Harris seemed to blow off New Hampshire for a good couple of years and didn't even respect the primary. You ran in the primary here.
I did, and not only that, I kept it there. I was the one. It was I could have gone with them. I could have done it exactly the way they did it. And I said to the people of New Hampshire, you're going to be first. So you had Iowa. This is a long-term tradition, Iowa, New Hampshire. And you're equal first, essentially. A little bit different, right? But you're the first primary. And I said, that's the way I'm going to keep it. And I never budged. And when they did that, I couldn't believe it, because it was so disrespectful to New Hampshire. You're out of it now as far as the Democrats are concerned. And I said, I hope they're going to remember that come Election Day. And we've got a close one up there. I don't even know why it's close. She's a Marxist. She'll destroy our country. She destroyed San Francisco, totally took the best city probably in the country and made it unlivable. It's not even livable anymore. It's not even functioning. And just did that with her horrible policies. And she destroyed California as the Attorney General. Look at California. Everyone's leaving.
I want to ask you this, former President Donald Trump. Harris said in that CNN pre-taped interview, she's not against fracking. Do you take her at her word?
No, well, she was against it her whole life. She doesn't even really know what fracking is. If you asked her to define fracking, she doesn't even know what it is. But she was against it for her whole career until about a few weeks ago. Then she decided, gee, this is not a very good thing to run on in Pennsylvania especially. And she's against it, and she won't have it. And if she wins, our country will never be able to come back. It'll be a disaster. You'll have over 100. Right now they've allowed more than 20 million to come in over the last 3.5 years. 20 million, many from prisons and jails, from mental institutions and insane asylums. Many terrorists have come into our country. And by the way, I made a prediction a couple of years ago. You see what's going on in Aurora and Chicago? The terrorists are taking over the city. These aren't just the Venezuelans, the criminals that they let in. Venezuela is shipping all of their criminals into the United States, and we accept them because we have a wide open border. And we had the strongest border in history 3.5 years ago. Now we have the worst border.
Former President Donald Trump, Republican presidential nominee, on the Good Morning New Hampshire radio show this morning with host Jack Heath. Donald Trump tonight is doing a town hall hosted by Fox News in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Tomorrow he speaks at the Economic Club of New York. Tomorrow, the Democratic presidential nominee, Vice President Kamala Harris, has a campaign stop in Pittsburgh. From Associated Press, the Biden administration on Wednesday announced criminal charges, the seizure of internet domains, and sanctions related to Russian disinformation efforts to influence the U.S. presidential election. Attorney General Merrick Garland said the actions relate to Russia's use of state media to enlist unwitting American influencers to spread propaganda and disinformation. That was from the AP article that state media referenced is RT, or Russia Today. The Attorney General spoke at the Justice Department at the start of an election threats task force meeting.
In the wake of Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, RT, which was then known as Russia Today, was dropped by its American distributors. The company ceased its formal operations in the United States, and the European Union, the UK, and Canada banned RT's broadcasting. But as RT itself has boasted, the government of Russia continued to use RT to direct disinformation and propaganda. In the wake of Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, RT's editor-in-chief said the company had built, quote, an entire empire of covert projects designed to shape public opinion in Western audiences. We allege that as part of that effort, RT and its employees, including the defendants, implemented a nearly $10 million scheme to fund and direct a Tennessee-based company to publish and disseminate content deemed favorable to the Russian government. To implement this scheme, the defendants directed the company to contract with U.S.-based social media influencers to share this content on their platforms. The subject matter and content of many of the videos published by the company were often consistent with Russia's interest in amplifying U.S. domestic divisions in order to weaken U.S. opposition to core Russian interests, particularly its ongoing war in Ukraine. The company never disclosed to the influencers or to their millions of followers its ties to RT and the Russian government. Instead, the defendants and the company claimed that the company was sponsored by a private investor. But that private investor was a fictitious persona. The charges unsealed this morning do not represent the end of the investigation. It remains active and ongoing. In a separate enforcement action, the Justice Department is seizing 32 internet domains that the Russian government and the Russian-sponsored actors have used to engage in a covert campaign to interfere and influence the outcome of our country's elections. As alleged in our court filings, President Vladimir Putin's inner circle, including Sergei Kirillenko, directed Russian public relations companies to promote disinformation and state-sponsored narratives as part of a program to influence the 2024 U.S. presidential election. An internal planning document created by the Kremlin states that as a goal of the campaign is securing Russia's preferred outcome in the election. The online infrastructure used by the Russian public relations company, known as the Social Design Agency, or SDA, and related actors included what are sometimes referred to as cyber-squatted domains. These websites were designed to appear to American readers as if they were major U.S. news sites like the Washington Post or Fox News. But in fact, they were fake sites. They were filled with Russian government propaganda that had been created by the Kremlin to reduce international support for Ukraine, bolster pro-Russian policies and interests, and influence voters in the United States and in other countries. Internal documents of the Kremlin describe the content as, quote, bogus stories disguised as newsworthy events, close quote. This malign influence campaign has been referred to as doppelganger.
Attorney General Merrick Garland today at the Justice Department in Washington, making the announcement at the start of an election threats task force meeting. At the State Department in Washington, spokesperson Matthew Miller at his regular news conference announced steps his department is taking on this issue.
According to information made public today by the Department of Justice, we now know that RT, formerly known as Russia Today, has moved beyond being simply a media organization. We know that RT has contracted with a private company to pay unwitting Americans millions of dollars to carry the Kremlin's message to influence the U.S. elections and undermine democracy. RT's leadership has created and directed this enterprise. Because of this development, the Department of State is taking 3 concrete actions today to protect the integrity of our democratic institutions. First, we are announcing a new policy to restrict visa issuance to certain individuals who, acting on behalf of Kremlin-supported media organizations, use those organizations as cover for covert activities and are responsible for or complicit in these malign efforts. Consistent with U.S. law, visa information is confidential, and the department is not at liberty to name these specific individuals. Second, the department has designated the operational presence of Rossiya Segodnya and its subsidiaries RIA Novosti, TV Novosti, Ruptly, and Sputnik as foreign missions, as they are effectively controlled by the government of the Russian Federation. As Foreign Missions Act designated entities, they will be required to notify the department of all personnel working in the United States and disclose all real property they hold. Finally, the department is announcing a Rewards for Justice offer to seek information on potential foreign efforts to interfere in U.S. elections, including by organizations such as Rodit, also known as Russian Angry Hackers Did It, which has previously engaged in covert election interference, influence abroad, and poses a threat to the 2024 U.S. elections. These actions are in addition to law enforcement actions announced today by the Department of Justice and new sanctions imposed by the Department of Treasury.
State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller at his news conference in Washington. An article at RT.com about these announcements has this paragraph. The 2 Russians charged face a maximum sentence of 5 years in prison for violating the Foreign Agents Registration Act and 20 years for money laundering. However, the charges against them will likely never be proven in an American courtroom, as the U.S. has no extradition treaty with Russia. The 2 Russians were also sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury Department on Wednesday, along with RT Editor-in-Chief Margarita Simonian, and 3 other senior RT employees. Simonian dismissed the charges, responding, "Great job, team," on Telegram. Simonian ridiculed U.S. officials for claiming, for the 3rd election in a row, that RT is attempting to interfere in American politics. She wrote in a follow-up post on Telegram, "If they kick us out completely, how will they conduct the next elections? They don't have any other strategies except to scaremonger about the almighty RT." That from an article at RT.com. House Republican leaders held a teleconference today to talk about their plans to tie together temporary government funding with a bill requiring proof of U.S. citizenship to vote. Joining us now on the phone to talk about it is Mychael Schnell, congressional reporter with The Hill. Thanks, as always, for being with us. What are your sources saying about how this plan is being received by the House Republican membership?
Yeah, look, it's a mixed bag, which is typically what you get when you're dealing with these government funding measures and matters within the House Republican Conference. Essentially, what Speaker Johnson and his leadership team rolled out during that conference call earlier today was a 6-month CR. It would fund the government through the end of March 2025. But attached to that is the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, which is commonly known as the SAVE Act. And essentially what that aims to do is require proof of citizenship to register to vote, something that a lot of opponents to the legislation have pointed out is that the point of the legislation is to prevent non-U.S. citizens from voting in elections, which opponents point out is already illegal. So essentially we're hearing a mixed bag from lawmakers. Some Republicans I've heard from have said that they don't think this gambit is going to be successful because the reality is in the closely divided House, and then when you're dealing with a Democratic-controlled Senate, really the only thing that's going to get through is what we like to call a clean CR, which is just a straight-up stopgap, does not include any other measures attached to it. And we're even hearing from some hardliners who are not in favor of this, and they see this gambit as just trying to move the SAVE Act as a messaging bill, knowing that it'll never be taken up in the Senate. But nonetheless, Republican leaders pushing this through, hoping that if it does squeak through the House, that it would put the House Republican Conference on better negotiating ground with the Senate. But again, this is just the opening salvo in what is likely going to be a pretty bitter and bit of a drawn-out fight. Congress has until September 30th to avert a shutdown. This is really just step one.
And because you said this is not likely to be the thing that becomes law, can we expect that it would come up relatively early, allowing more time for a clean CR to make it through?
Yes. A source on the call told me that Johnson told members he wants to bring this up, quote, as early as possible. House Majority Whip Tom Emmer said he's going to begin whipping the legislation, which means essentially asking members where they stand on it on Monday, which means that, leadership is trying to get the ball rolling here and get things moving, because in the event that this does fail, they want to have as much time to regroup and try to get new legislation on the floor to avert a shutdown. Again, the House is set to reconvene on Monday evening. That'll be the first day of what is scheduled to be a 3-week stretch of the House being in session.
You mentioned that this might be moved as a messaging bill. How much does this have to do with the presidential election?
A lot of it. This SAVE Act is something that has been endorsed by former President Trump. He actually helped roll out the legislation alongside Speaker Johnson at an event in Mar-a-Lago earlier this year. In fact, Trump is saying that a shutdown would be worth it to get this legislation over the finish line. He was on a podcast last week, and he said, quote, "I would shut down the government in a heartbeat if they don't get it." So former President Trump making very clear where he stands on this piece of legislation. And that could likely be where House Republican leadership is taking some of their cues from. Remember, this is sort of an interesting situation. You have the election just 2 months away. Trump has a large influence over the House Republican Conference. And if this 6-month CR does come to fruition, Republicans are hoping and quite frankly betting that Trump will be back in the White House when the stopgap expires at the end of March, giving him an opportunity to have an imprint on government funding. So in a lot of different ways, the 2024 election is hanging over the spending fight.
We're talking with Mychael Schnell, congressional reporter with The Hill. 2 more questions. One, it is a CR, meaning it's the same funding as the current year. So who are the winners and losers in that?
Yeah, that's right. Typically speaking, Republicans are always trying to cut back on government funding. You'd assume that they'd want to have less funding than the current year, which doesn't usually happen because there are matters that need more money in different areas of the government. So the fact that it would be, sort of this current funding levels Democrats would be happy with that. But we're still just far away from the winners and losers games yet, because there's so many different things that are riding on this. Democrats likely not going to be too thrilled with a 6-month CR. They would probably rather get it buttoned up before the new year starts and not put the risk of having former President Trump influence the budget. Right now, of course, they still have President Biden in the White House. And then that SAVE Act, that's going to be a real problem and issue for Democrats. They are against that legislation. It did pass with 5 Democratic votes in the House, but Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has said that it will not come up in the Senate. So they definitely want to get that SAVE Act off of this legislative plan.
And the final question, this, whatever gets through, clean CR likely, if at all, is the last train leaving the station, as they say. So what else might be attached to that bill?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and that's why the length of this thing is so key, right? If they do end up passing a 6-month CR, you're right. That's likely one of the last big ticket items that will pass through Congress. Now, if it's ends up being a 2-month CR or 2.5-month CR, what have you, and lawmakers are back at this in December, they'll have another opportunity to use this government funding legislation as a vehicle to move more legislation. But there are other priorities to deal with. There is, for example, the Farm Bill, which some of its programs face a September 30th deadline. There's going to have to be the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. That's the yearly defense bill. So there are other matters that are going to have to move through Congress in the next few months, even though, Congress is just in session this month in September. Then they're going to be out for the month of October so folks can campaign, and they're going to be back in November. But look, that's going to be a completely different political landscape. Members are going to be reacting to and preparing for legislating under a new president. Leadership elections are going to be underway, and they'll have those other deadlines and potentially another spending fight on their hands. So it's going to be a very high stakes, really sprint to the end of the year.
Mychael Schnell, congressional reporter with The Hill. Find your stories at thehill.com and on X at Mychael Schnell. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Wall Street today, the Dow up 38, NASDAQ down 52, and S&P down 8. Story at CNBC, job openings slumped to their lowest level in 3.5 years in July, the Labor Department reported Wednesday, and another sign of slack in the labor market. The data likely provides further ammunition to Federal Reserve officials who are widely expected to begin lowering interest rates when they meet for their next policy meeting on September 17th and 18th. From CNBC. Washington Today continues in a moment.
Watch the ABC News presidential debate simulcast live on the C-SPAN networks, Tuesday, September 10th, as the candidates go head-to-head for their first debate since securing their party's nominations. Coverage begins with a preview show at 8 p.m., followed by the debate at 9 p.m. Eastern. The ABC News presidential debate simulcast, live Tuesday, September 10th, on the C-SPAN networks. C-SPAN, your unfiltered view of politics. Powered by cable.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you find your podcasts. New York Governor Kathy Hochul, a Democrat, says she was shocked at the federal indictment of a former aide accused of working for the Chinese government. Story from ABC News writes that Linda's son schemed to advance the interests of China while working in New York state government. Federal prosecutors alleged in an indictment unsealed Tuesday. The indictment charges son with failure to register as a foreign agent, visa fraud, alien smuggling, and money laundering conspiracy. Her husband, Christopher Hu, allegedly facilitated the transfer of millions of dollars in kickbacks for personal gain, prosecutors said. That was reporting from ABC News. Governor Hochul was interviewed today by Amna Nawaz, PBS NewsHour co-anchor and Semaphore News contributor at a Semaphore News program.
Governor, I wouldn't be doing my job as a journalist if I didn't ask you about recent news about your office, and that was the story that broke yesterday about your former Deputy Chief of Staff, Linda's son, who was arrested and charged with acting as an undisclosed agent of the Chinese government. Your office has made clear she'd been fired in March of 2023 for misconduct, and you are cooperating with law enforcement. But is there anything else you can tell us about that case?
Absolutely shocking. And she has been in government for many, many years, even prior to the time I became governor, where she was involved in making a lot of decisions related to the relationship between the administration at the time and the Chinese government, promoting Chinese, viewpoints and giving them proclamations and visas, and actually at the same time really diminishing any involvement with the country of Taiwan. It is shocking in its scale. I'm glad we were able to see some evidence that was, didn't look right to us, and we immediately alerted the authorities, and hence we have this outcome. And I would just say this, to think that that any foreign agent, any foreign government has the audacity to infiltrate a government organization like the state of New York has to be addressed with. And we'll be talking more about what we want to see happen later in today. But I will say this, everyone should be aware who they are empowering with positions. Again, she was doing more proclamations and outreach to the community. She had no access to documentation or security information at all, or cyber security. So there was a limit to it. On the other hand, it never should have happened. And we're taking strong actions at this time, again, cooperating with the Eastern District of New York fully to make sure that they have everything they need from us.
New York Governor Kathy Hochul, a Democrat, interviewed at a Semaphore News program today. From CNN, Linda Sun and husband Christopher Hu both pleaded not guilty to all charges Tuesday afternoon. Sun's bond is set at $1.5 million, and her husband's is set at $500,000. Both will have their travel limited to New York City, Long Island, Maine, and New Hampshire. An attorney for Sun told CNN the charges are inflammatory and appear to be the product of an overly aggressive prosecution. From the Jerusalem Post, Israel could agree to leave the Philadelphia corridor within the parameters of a permanent ceasefire, such as would be discussed in Phase 2 of the hostage deal, but not in Phase 1, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu told the foreign media in a special press briefing in Jerusalem Wednesday night. It's unlikely, he said, that a realistic security plan exists that would prevent the smuggling of weapons under that critical buffer zone between Egypt and Gaza. Some of the reporting from the Jerusalem Post. C-SPAN covered this news conference with the Prime Minister in Jerusalem. Here is one question from a reporter about a hostage.
The mother of Almog Sarusi, one of the murdered hostages, says you sacrificed her son on the altar of the Philadelphia corridor. If the price of your refusal to withdraw from the Egypt-Gaza border is more hostages are killed, is that a price you are prepared to pay? And is that a price the people of Israel will accept?
I can understand the great torment that the mother of this murdered hostage feels. I can understand her rage. I can understand her sorrow. So I'm not going to stand in judgment of that. I'm not going to argue with it. I'm just going to talk about the facts. I'm committed to getting all of them out. I got more than half out, and more than half of the hostages alive out because we employed the pressure points. We leave the pressure, we're going to get no one out. I'm committed as the Prime Minister of Israel to two things. They're right here. The first one is to achieve the release of the hostages, and the second is to protect the security of Israel and make sure that we have no more hostage taking, no more murders, no more rapes, and no more rocketing of Israel, both of them. We have to have this and this together. That's what I'm going to do. That's what I'm committed to do.
Philadelphia corridor is so critical, as you say. Why is it you left it 7-8 months into the Israeli ground offensive before seizing it?
Well, it was critical also to destroy Hamas, to kill about 20,000 of their operatives, to kill their senior military commanders, to get Gaza City, to get the Shifa Hospital, which was a major headquarters, to get Khan Yunis, to get the central camps, and to get Rafah, obviously. So this was the military plan that the military and the political echelon agreed upon. We were never going to leave, I was never going to leave Rafah alone, and you know that. And I was also not going to leave Philadelphia alone. I said that 20 years ago. I said it's critical that we not leave Philadelphia. When Sharon did the disengagement, I said we have to get there. So we got there. It took a while to do, but it was a progression of military advancement that produced the result. So we're there now. Now once we're in, now we'll leave. You know we'll leave, we won't come back. You know it, everybody here knows it. Everybody here knows what pressure will be brought on us so that we don't come back. What price we'll have to pay if we do want to come back. It's just not going to happen. We're going to be there, despite the pressure.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at a news conference today in Jerusalem. Article from the Times of Israel. The United Nations Security Council slated to discuss on Wednesday the hostages being held by Hamas in Gaza, as well as the overall conflict following the murders of 6 Israeli hostages by their Hamas captors over the weekend. Meanwhile, UN Human Rights Chief Volker Turk called on Tuesday for an independent investigation into reports that the 6 Israeli hostages were summarily executed by Palestinian terrorists in Gaza. Hamas has since released propaganda footage showing all 6 of the hostages alive during their time in captivity, appearing to admit to killing them on Monday by noting that new instructions were issued to the mujahideen assigned to guard the prisoners regarding dealing with them if the occupation army approached their place of detention. That was reporting from the Times of Israel. At the UN Security Council in New York City, here is the U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield.
The 6 hostages killed this weekend were executed at the same time negotiators were discussing the names of individuals to be released in a ceasefire deal. It calls into question the sincerity of Hamas negotiators, and it reveals yet again the ugly truth about the vile, depraved ideology that Hamas represents. From its massacre of 1,200 people to its weaponization of sexual violence. These latest murders confirm that Hamas is a terrorist organization. I know some members of this council won't acknowledge that, but that's the simple truth. No member of this council would tolerate their citizens being taken hostage and murdered, not a single one of us. The United States strongly condemns Hamas's brutality. It is long, long past time this council do the same. Make no mistake, we can condemn Hamas for what they are and still have empathy for the suffering Palestinians in Gaza, men, women, and children who are also experiencing agony. While Sinwar hides in tunnels underneath the ground and his henchmen murder hostages, Palestinian civilians are living in a hell on earth. Their lives continue to be put at risk by his cowardice and intransigence. As President Biden has made clear, Hamas's leadership will pay for their crimes. They must be held accountable. They cannot control Gaza. At the same time, we know that the best way to rescue the remaining hostages and alleviate the suffering of Palestinian civilians is through a negotiated ceasefire deal, one that will release the hostages and create conditions to enable a surge in life-saving aid in Gaza.
Linda Thomas Greenfield is the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations at today's Security Council meeting at the UN in New York City. The ambassador from Algeria is Amar Benjama.
I cannot help but think that had the ceasefire been imposed, more than 3,000 Palestinians, half of them women and children, would have been spared. I cannot help but think that had the ceasefire been enforced by this council, the 6 hostages would be alive and free today. For us, there can be no double standard in recognizing suffering or in grieving the loss of a loved one. For us, every life matters. Mr. President, the Israeli occupation continues inflicting collective punishment upon the Palestinians in Gaza and West Bank. The staggering toll of death and destruction reveals a barbarism aimed at erasing the Palestinian identity and with it, the vision of the Palestinian state. As the world struggles to secure a ceasefire in Gaza, despite the clear demand from the international community, including this very council, the Israeli occupier escalate.
Ambassador from Algeria to the United Nations, Amar Benjama, at today's United Nations Security Council meeting on the war in Gaza and the holding of hostages. Jewish Chronicle in London has an article. Opposition leader Rishi Sunak challenged the government's decision to suspend 30 of the United Kingdom's 350 arms export licenses to Israel at Prime Minister's questions. Sunak also questioned the Prime Minister over a reported rift with the United States over arms sales to Israel. The Conservative leader said it was essential to maintain transatlantic unity in the face of terrorist threats and avoid any perception of splits between our two nations. That was from the article at the Jewish Chronicle out of London. Here is part of Prime Minister's questions in the British House of Commons today. Prime Minister Keir Starmer of the Labour Party questioned by the opposition leader Rishi Sunak of the Conservatives.
The government has suspended 30 of the UK's 350 arms export licenses to Israel. It's a decision that the chief rabbi says beggars belief and will encourage our shared enemies. Can the Prime Minister therefore explain how his decision will help to secure the release of the 101 hostages still being held by Hamas?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I start by saying I think the whole House will be shocked by the horrific killing of 6 hostages in the last few days. And I know I speak for the whole House when I say that. The remaining hostages must be released, and we need a ceasefire to ensure that that can happen, that aid desperately needed can get into the region, and we can begin the path to a two-state solution. Now, he asks how we arrived at this decision. He knows very well, because the legal framework is clear. The latest guidance was issued in 2021 under his government. And that means that licences have to be kept under review, as they were by his government. And I think he probably knows the advice that was given to his government. He understands the framework. We've carried out the review in the same way and come to a clear legal conclusion. And shared that conclusion, the assessment, with Parliament. We will, of course, continue to stand by Israel's right to self-defence. But it is important that we are a country committed to the international rule of law. That gives us the strength of argument with our allies on important issues. This is a difficult issue, I recognise that, but it's a legal decision, not a policy decision. And the Prime Minister knows the framework, and they issued the guidance, they know what the test is, that test has been assessed, we've come to a conclusion, and we've put that before the House to consider.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the Prime Minister's answer, but he'll know that decisions like this also have important and broader geopolitical implications. And he mentioned allies. It's essential that we maintain transatlantic unity in the face of terrorist threats and avoid any perception of splits between our two nations. So can he therefore update the House or tell the House what engagement he had with the United States prior to taking this significant decision?
Prime Minister.
I acknowledge the importance of working with our allies on all issues, as we have been doing, as I was able to make very clear at the NATO summit that I attended in the early summer. And of course, as he would expect, as the House would expect, we have talked this through with our allies. They understand. They have a different legal system. That is the point they made. It chunters from the. This is a serious issue. It requires serious consideration. And the Prime Minister knows the legal framework. He knows the legal framework very well. He also knows that applying that framework, the facts of that framework, and arriving at a decision does not permit me to simply then say I'm not going to implement the legal decision and conclusion that's been reached. I don't think he's really inviting me to do that.
Prime Minister of Great Britain Keir Starmer, head of the Labour Party, taking questions from the opposition leader Rishi Sunak of the Conservative Party during Prime Minister's question time in the British House of Commons in London today. And this is Washington Today. Associated Press out of Cape Canaveral, Florida, writes that Boeing will attempt to return its problem-plagued capsule from the International Space Station later this week with empty seats. NASA said Wednesday that everything is on track for the Starliner capsule to undock from the space station Friday evening. The fully automated capsule will aim for a touchdown in New Mexico's White Sands Missile Range 6 hours later. NASA's 2 stuck astronauts who flew up on Starliner will remain behind at the orbiting lab. They'll ride home with SpaceX in February, 8 months after launching on what should have been a week-long test flight. Thruster trouble and helium leaks kept delaying their return until NASA decided that it was too risky for them to accompany Starliner back as originally planned. That was from Associated Press. Steve Stitch is NASA's Commercial Crew Program Manager. He took part in a news conference today at Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas.
It was really hard to determine whether to be uncrewed or not. I would say the teams were very split in the uncertainty relative to the thrusters, and so the NASA team chose to return Butch and Sonny on Dragon.
We'll go to our next question from David Denault with About Space Today.
My question is for Steve. At our last briefing and what you've just said about the meeting between Boeing and NASA, and after the briefing, several people have come forward and said it was kind of a very heated meeting, almost a shouting match, and Boeing's insistence in saying their spacecraft is safe for astronauts. Could you comment on that and kind of bring this to an end?
Yeah, I would say the last meeting we had where we talked detailed technical data on the different positions and the different analyses, I would not characterize it as heated. I would say anytime you're in a meeting of this magnitude where there's this kind of decision, there is some tension in the room. Boeing believed in the model that they had created that tried to predict thruster degradation for the rest of the flight. I would say the NASA team looked at the model and saw some limitations, and it really had to do with, do we have confidence in the thrusters and how much we could predict their degradation from undock through the deorbit burn? And the NASA team, due to the uncertainty in the modeling, could not get comfortable with that. And so I wouldn't say it was a yelling, screaming kind of meeting. It was a tense technical discussion where we had both sides listening intently to all the data, and in the end, to make a decision whether to return crewed or uncrewed. And NASA chose to allow Butch and Sonny to stay on station, return on Crew 9, and we'll bring the vehicle back uncrewed on Friday.
Steve Stitch, NASA Commercial Crew Program Manager at today's news conference at Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. And on NASA's website, there's this. Starliner is scheduled to autonomously undock from the space station at approximately 6:04 p.m. Eastern Time Friday, September 6th, to begin the journey home, weather conditions permitting. NASA and Boeing are targeting approximately 12:03 a.m. Saturday, September 7th, for the landing and conclusion of the flight test. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Subscribe to C-SPAN's free evening newsletter Word for Word and get the stories making headlines in Washington sent to your inbox every day. Sign up at cspan.org/connect. Have a good night.